From debates to impeachment probes, there are examples, past and present, of politicians who choose not to participate in the political process. There's the current example of the House of Representatives' ongoing impeachment inquiry, and members of President Donald Trump's administration saying it's illegitimate. So, is it common for politicians to choose not to participate? I posed that question to political consultant Ryan McCollum and Adam Hilton, assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College.
Broadly speaking, no, it isn't. Part of the ambiguity here rests on how political officials are both representatives in two senses, right? They're representatives of their constituents, meaning they're supposed to do what their constituents want, but they're also trustee representatives. We elect them to office in order to give them the responsibility of doing what they think is in our best interest. And the occasional handful of times we can look at someone as prominent as a president refusing to engage in the normal political process is they've often tried to claim that they're above politics altogether, right? That they don't want to dirty their hands in the political process itself. Probably the most prominent example that comes to mind and perhaps the most relevant comparison for the broad situation here is Nixon refusing to debate George McGovern in the 1972 the 1972 election.
And that's a huge stage for that to happen on, right? What was the reaction to that at the time?
Well, at the time, Nixon bogged down in tough negotiations over the Vietnam War, being a world diplomat, visiting China. He could claim that he had much bigger fish to fry, that he was above getting his hands dirty in the basic political process. And
it worked.
Due to that ambiguity in the nature of political office, it could work.
Yeah. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this political process and choosing not to participate in it? What's the impact that you see?
I think, overall, there's a broad impact of folks who might feel as though they, as a voter, deserve to see who they might be voting for. And so whether it's an incumbent who decides not to debate or another candidate who doesn't show up to certain things. It's not always a debate. Sometimes there's events where, it's a forum and there's a bunch of candidates and they decide not to be there because they think it's in their best interest not to be there. But I think overall, everybody kind of believes that as voters, we should be able to see who we're going to vote for and see them toe to toe and what their vision is or what their accomplishments are before we go to the polls and vote for somebody.
When voters don't have that opportunity to sort of compare side by side, what are the other avenues that they turn to sort of figure out differences?
Well, they didn't have it during the Nixon era, but we have the internet. And the internet is a tool to also see who the people you are voting for. But even there are some candidates who decide not to have a website, not to have Facebook, and to go off of maybe their popularity or their accomplishments or the things that folks know of them in the past. So you can use the internet. You hope that folks like you and the media out there and the fourth establishment actually get the stories out and get the profiles out on who's running. So you can also go and read the paper and hopefully watch the news and see about these folks.
Is it a missed opportunity for the challenger if the incumbent chooses not to debate?
Absolutely.
What does it do?
Well, for one, the incumbent is the person who mostly draws the news, right? Depending on the level of office, the advantage of incumbency is that by calling a press conference, you will get media attention. Entering a debate can offer a lot of spotlight and exposure for challengers who might not otherwise get it.
I want to talk a little bit about the impeachment inquiry that's going on. News recently this week that the Department of Defense Secretary Mark Esper is not going to comply with the impeachment inquiry, and the Department of Defense said that the subpoena that they're being presented with is invalid and it violates executive privilege. What do you think about that?
Well, this is a whole different level than just refusing to debate somebody or show up at a public forum. This constitutes a genuine constitutional crisis rather than just a political controversy. The firewalls that the Trump administration has been trying to build around this particular impeachment inquiry have begun to crumble a bit. We've seen people that have at first refused to testify come forward and testify. This seems par for the course in terms of what we've known about Trump and his administration in terms of flouting some of the basic norms and ideas that have governed American politics for a long time. And simply put, from their perspective, I don't see that they would have any incentive to comply with the impeachment inquiry from Congress. I think they only have everything to lose.
Yeah, when you look at Giuliani, right? So he's a private citizen, but his lawyer, they've attacked the subpoena itself by saying the subpoena is invalid and it's overbroad and it's burdensome. They've attacked the inquiry itself, saying the inquiry is unconstitutional, and then they've used a defense where they defend themselves by saying there's executive privilege, there's attorney-client privilege. Some of this is work product, and work product is privilege. So they are going to continue to obstruct. And the House did a report about, and it stemmed from Don McGahn, who was the former White House counsel who refused to show up for questioning and refused a subpoena during the Mueller investigation. And their 66-page report, the glaring thing was that the president is obstructing his own impeachment, which is an interesting and fascinating thing to watch play out.
The death of Elijah Cummings, who passed away earlier this week. Do you think this will have a massive impact or a slight impact on what's going on in any way?
I don't think so. I mean, he was beloved by many down there. Recently Elijah, Congressman Cummings was in the news because Trump attacked him and attacked Baltimore. And a lot of people came to his aid because he's a civil rights icon. And how dare President Trump try to attack somebody like Elijah Cummings? So there will be, a lot of heavy hearts there. And so maybe there's a day or two where they're not doing the people's business because they're paying respects to Congressman Cummings. But I do think it'll show those clips about Trump attacking this great man, just kind of like when McCain passed away. It's another way close to an election to show who Trump is.
You mentioned a moment ago there are a few points in history that we can look to where impeachment came up. President Nixon, who you mentioned earlier, and also President Clinton. And when I look at President Nixon, he didn't necessarily refuse to comply with the political process. He looked, in my estimation, at a political process and said, nope. He sort of removed himself from the fray.
Yeah, and I think that's partly what he did. The thing that has become kind of the conventional wisdom, of course, is that it wasn't the break-in to the DNC headquarters that got Nixon impeached or nearly impeached, but it was the cover-up, right? And it was the clear knowledge that he had of the cover-up situation. And again, Nixon being Nixon and trying to play a hands-off kind of, I'm too busy, I'm too much of a world diplomat to get bogged down in this, tried to retreat from it. But I think what we've learned about Nixon in the time since is that was a deep part of his almost paranoid level of personality that had kind of consumed him by the end of this process, and led, I think, directly to his resignation.
And so it's also interesting when you look at precedents. Senator Lindsey Graham in '98 was talking about back to the subpoenas, if you don't comply with congressional subpoenas, that's impeachable. They've dredged that speech up that he made in '98, and they recently asked him, do you still believe that? And Lindsey Graham, who cozies up to Trump from time to time, said, yes, I still find it impeachable. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
This conversation, looking at political process, also has me thinking about we're heading toward 2020. It's an election cycle. It has me thinking about different types of political processes, different types of campaigns, different approaches to campaigns. And I was sort of putting them in different bins and buckets. We saw President Trump run the Drain the Swamp, anti-establishment, I'm the government outsider campaign, which I feel like we have seen in years past. As you look at the Democratic field, do you see candidates putting themselves in these buckets in any particular way, shape, or form that stands out to you in any way that's notable?
Yeah, I think it's notable where the buckets are more on the spectrum, right? And so on the Democratic side, you have Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, kind of staking out the claim and fighting over the I don't want to call them the far left, but the more progressive folks. You have Biden kind of in the middle. Now you see Mayor Pete kind of, being a moderate, Amy Klobuchar. So there are, amongst the front runners, two different buckets, which is the progressives, quote unquote, who believe in Medicare for all, and even Beto O'Rourke, who's talking about a mandatory gun buyback, who are much more progressive on some of the issues that Democrats care about, and then those folks who are moderates, who are trying to say we're more pragmatic and you need to get incremental change. I think they all agree on the fact that Trump needs to go and how terrible Trump has been, but those are the two buckets that I see.
For the electorate, when voters are trying to decide, especially you have a debate this week with 12 different Democrats trying to get their 15-second slices of airtime to differentiate themselves. How do those sort of labels that candidates, or the ways that candidates approach their campaign style, help or don't help a voter to make a choice?
Yeah, well, it's important to distinguish what kinds of voters we're talking about here. The primary electorate is a distinctive electorate. It tends to be more educated people, tends to be people of moderate to higher incomes, tends to be people who have fairly distinct ideological identifications. While it's the case that moderates tend to try and make appeals towards the general election, it's very much the case that the more liberal in the case of the Democratic Party, the more conservative in the case of the Republican Party, they are much more likely to succeed in primaries. And we're beginning to see that, right, with Warren's pretty steady increase in support, now more or less tied, if not exceeding Joe Biden, who has been trying to ride the legacy of Obama, who is, of course, the master at being everything to all people, and was one reason he was able to do what he did back in 2008. But I think when it comes to the general election, the fear, of course, the specter of McGovern and other progressives continues to haunt the party, that you will nominate a candidate who the primary electorate likes quite a lot, but who will fail to carry the general election.